Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about how the world of work and our attitudes to work are changing. This show is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, a London-based company where we help teams and organizations transition to an office-optional approach. To have a look at what we do and the show notes to our podcast episodes, head over to virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you for spending your time with us. Hello and welcome to episode 214 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar Orti. If we haven't met before, welcome. I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you're a regular listener, thank you for still being here with us with all the shows that there are out there now. We've been going around for 5 years. Hurrah! So anyway, the format of the show has evolved. And today I've got another show with a few guests packed in. I've got 3 guests talking about how remote work is being experienced, talked about, adopted or not in Portugal, Italy and Spain. So I thought, if you listen to this show, you're probably getting a view of how things are being done, mainly in the UK, in the US, and that seems to be what's driving the conversation. Well, I'm based in London, so and a lot of my guests are either working for American companies or are based in the US or the UK, and we do have other people joining us from places like Australia. But I do think that the conversation is being driven very much, at least by the English-speaking countries. So I thought that rather than just looking at statistics of how things are being adopted in other countries, it would be good, as always, to hear the personal experience of people who are based in other countries. How are remote workers experiencing their context? So there's not going to be a what's going on section for this episode because I did record one and I thought the episode is just getting too big. So next episode is like a mega what's going on episode. It's the updates, not updates, but a recap of the year. What Maya and I have seen have been the salient topics, conversations, what articles we think have been important. So I will move everything there just to say, Eva, who's our third guest, does mention the experiment of Microsoft Japan with the 4-day week. So we'll stick the link to that in the show notes so you can have a look. And I just want to say hello, because I was going to bring in their contributions today, but I'll wait till next episode. I want to say hello to listeners Anna, Diana, and Jackie. All right, let's get on with the episode. Working on this show has been really fascinating for me. So for those of you who haven't met me before, hello. My name is Pilar Orti and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, which has the registered office in London. London is where I live and where I've lived since 1990. I did grow up in Madrid. However, I went to a British school all my life, so O-levels, A-levels. My parents had spent, before I was born, 4 years in the US, in California. And my upbringing, yes, of course, I grew up in Spain, but the reason why I live in London is because my way of working and of living actually suits London better. So London suits me better than Madrid. So all my experience of work culture has been in the UK. And also mostly as a freelancer. And more recently, I'm surrounded by people who work in the future of work space, just to give it a name. Although I do have many friends who work for very traditional companies, and that keeps my feet on the ground. And it really gives me access to conversations about what the majority of people working, especially in the knowledge work sector, are experiencing. During my conversations with Felippe, Giovanni and Eva, and I will introduce each one as we go, they brought up some of the stuff that I never thought of. And also it made me realize that some of the reasons why remote work gets adopted or not, especially in organizations, is universal. I mean, I'll leave it up to you to make those connections as you listen. But so some of the things I hadn't thought of when we hear the numbers about people adopting remote work. First, we always need to look at which country it's coming from. I'm sure lots of you are doing that. It's the first thing I look at. Then we need to put them into context of the types of work that are most prevalent in a country. And also the kind of companies and businesses and organizations that make up the workforce or the labor market in general. And it was mainly through my conversation with Eva that I thought, that's something I just haven't been doing. Well, also Giovanni reminded me that remote is just one more part of creating a better work culture. I mean, we saw this also in the episode 212, I think it was, on remote work for social change, that remote work sometimes is not an end in itself. It's actually a means to an end. And also, Giovanni reminded me that the importance of social contact in a country, in that culture, is going to have a big effect on whether location independence from each other. It's not just about the work being location independence. It's about our collaboration and contact being location independent. That's going to be affected by how social a country is. And when I mentioned on Twitter that I was doing this episode, Tim Burgess, who regular listeners will have heard in a couple of past episodes and will hear in many more, Tim said on Twitter, Europe seems quite divided in work from home. So he's specific about working from home. North versus south, and maybe even east versus west. I wonder if there is a cultural element as well. Maybe countries who have a more individualistic culture are more predisposed towards working from home. Maybe. And it makes sense with what Giovanni was saying. So really interesting. So Tim is based in Australia. So again, I like that further away point of view. Nice. Thank you, Tim. And listeners, Twitter at Pilar Orti. You can get in touch with me at Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O is the company's Twitter handle, which Maya looks after. And also both Giovanni and Felippe talked about the different expectations around location independence, differences between generations. Now, I thought this was going to be a short journey around Southern Europe, but we do make a little detour into areas of Southern and Central America, as Felippe and Giovanni have connections with those countries too. So why not find out what's going on there too? So let's start over in Portugal, where I talked to Felippe Silveira, co-founder and creative director of Mowe Studio. He is in Lisbon, Portugal, but he's originally from Brazil, and the company was actually set up in the US. So let's hear from Felippe.
I started this company when I was in Brazil. Was just me and my partner by that time, but we were always thinking about the remote environment, and to take this further, we should go remote. So when the opportunity happens to actually open the company, we open it in the US. And right now we are in Europe as well. I'm here in Lisbon. I have my partner with me in Barcelona, and a lot of my team in Brazil, and also part in the US. And what we do is we are a creative studio focused on animation, 2D animation and motion graphics. And we've worked with clients like Google, Adobe, Pfizer, PepsiCo, and many other startups as well.
Mm-hmm. And you work with them remotely, I imagine, or not?
Everything remotely, yeah. Our full-time people, it's, I believe right now we are 8. I always forget because, the full time is 8, and now at the moment we are having 4 more freelancers work with us, so we are 12 at a time. It's in-house, but they are all remote, let's say, because the term in-house, it feels like we are actually in a building, right? but in the end we are all remote. So the whole company operates remote, and this is the way we divide our team.
Wonderful. I do like that, using the in-house, even though there is no physical house, but there is a cloud-based house, I imagine.
Yeah. So we can say a team in cloud.
How does remote work? How is it seen around the people around you? For example, in Portugal, what do you see? Is the way you work very different to professionals around you? Is it something that's still seen as a bit different? I haven't got a clue as to how remote work in all sorts of ways is being seen in Portugal.
Yeah. So actually, it was a surprise for me because I'm not in Portugal for so long, but like with a background from Brazil. Brazil, if I'm not like from São Paulo or Rio, it's like a weird thing. Like you're working from home. What is this?
Uh-huh.
But is it legal? You know. when I came to Portugal, especially the Lisbon region, I believe it's not only a country culture but also a region culture. And here in Lisbon is a really technological city. So in terms of they have many startups, they have a lot of investments in tech companies come here, and usually companies around tech are more open on the remote work environment. And what I saw is not only this being more frequent here, but also I believe I know at least 10 people here in Portugal, and I don't know many people here that they work remotely, and like even my landlord work remotely. So it's like it's like a thing that is more common than I thought it would be. I always thought that, of course, Europe has a different culture than South America, where I'm from. But what I saw in Portugal was that they are more, they absorbed more this culture, and they seem to be more open to it. I believe that part of being like a small country, you know, like in the Western Europe is like one of the smallest countries. So I believe part of that to be able to grow is to interact more with our neighborhoods, so like France, Spain, and even the UK. So to be able to do this, they need to learn how to operate remotely. I believe this is part of how the culture was built here.
I hadn't thought of that. That is also very interesting. How many, remind us again how long you've been in Lisbon?
Oh, actually, here just a couple of months.
A couple of months.
But, okay. Yeah, but I've been Great. I lived in Spain a couple of years ago. Spain, I was in Barcelona. Mm-hmm. Of course, I believe I'll bring someone better knowledge from Spain. But I would say like the capitals or the biggest cities are usually places that are more open to have these, to find people there that works remotely, or to have people there in companies that operate this way. So, but I've been in Europe like every year since I lived in Spain. So I lived in Spain like 6 years ago. Every time I'm here, I try to get more involved with the people who are working here and get to understand how they operate. But in Portugal was a place that I found that wasn't expecting that much. And then I found like a really nice culture around remote working.
And what kind of people are you interacting with in the remote space? You were mentioning some tech companies, but is this freelancers, workers for full-time workers, startups, small business owners? Who is the remote worker around you?
Like more close to me, like designers is, I believe, is the easiest one for you to find a remote worker designer. But I also know some business owners here. One of them in the design environment, but he's like working remotely here while part of the company is in Brazil. And also I found people around real estate as also another way to work remotely, as they don't actually need a physical place for their clients to go to. They just need to go to the properties to show to their clients. So it's like they do everything, let's say, remote, but they need to be in a location somehow to, of course, they can work remotely with another country, but like in a way they don't have like an office, a traditional office. But I've seen like in technology and what is more artistic, let's say like writers, designers. So those are like the environments I saw more people going and working remotely.
Do you work from a co-working space, or where do you work from?
I work from home. I have my office here, aka a table. But I've worked in co-working spaces before, not as a, let's say, full-time co-working space, but from time to time, I think it's good, especially for those who work from home, to go working in a different environment. Especially while traveling, I tend to go to many coffee shops to get some work done. But whenever I can, I always like to visit co-working spaces because I like to meet people, and those are the best places to meet people, especially people who are working in an environment that is similar to ours.
And I have to ask you about Brazil because you glossed over it, and I'd be very interested also to see.
Yeah.
So, of course, Brazil is even larger than the other countries we're talking about.
Oh,
so
yeah.
There's probably much more diversity. But what is your experience of how remote work is being viewed there, and how it's being experienced, and when or where?
Like I said, Brazil is really larger than every other country we're talking here. By being from from the south part of the world, is a different culture. In Brazil, what we have is like the big cities, the big hubs like São Paulo and Rio. Those are the places that people are still going to get work, to find a job. So where the big companies are. We have a lot of people working from home as well, but it's not as common as usual as you see here in Europe. And depending on how old people are there, it's really weird the fact that people are just working over the internet,
Mm-hmm.
So it's I would say like people there is somehow very traditional and not so open to new things. But like I was talking here, like if you go to the big centers, you'll find a different point of view. But in Brazil, it's not so easy to find people working remotely, because there, especially in the creative industry, is a different way of how people see the creative industry in Brazil in comparison to the rest of the world. So in Brazil, we still have the mentality of, for you to succeed in life, you need to go to the traditional path of being a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. So this is like the generation for my parents, and still the whole creative industry with this remote thing is still something really fresh and new. But I've seen like especially like I told you, like tech companies are those I see more open to try new things and try new stuff. So we have a lot of tech companies also in Brazil that more in front of working with people remotely. The designers in Brazil are really, really good. So they are work with clients around the world. But besides those directions, like those fields, it's really hard to find someone there that work this way.
Really interesting. I hadn't thought of the link between the industries where it's easier to adopt remote work, the link between the industries and how the industries are perceived in the country. Of course, that affects how remote work in general is seen by the country.
Yeah.
Really interesting. As you've experienced different countries, how is the adoption of remote work viewed by those who are not doing the remote work, by those who are in the more traditional setups? Anything else we haven't touched upon?
Yeah, I can talk about my experience. Actually, last week, I was speaking at a conference that was all about the workspace and work environment. And they were talking about like ways to attract millennials to work in those companies, how to keep people motivated and stuff, and how to use like the architecture around people to allow them to do better work, better engage with the company. And I was there as the black sheep, talking about remote work and actually going against everything there. And what I saw is people were like, I can say like they were like big companies, more traditional companies. I saw like their biggest concern was in how to attract the younger generation. So they were talking a lot about millennials. I see that somehow the remote environment is more attractive for the younger generation, especially because in the past we had like this traditional way of you get into a company as an intern and then you go up until you retire. And in my this generation, I'm about to turn 30 next month, so it's not so I'm not so old. I'm actually pretty young. So in my generation, I see people is not willing to go into this path of, oh, I'm gonna be in this company for the rest of my life so I can retire with a nice no salary after my retirement. So what I see in my generation, they are looking for better ways of living since the beginning. So experience life, travel more, and while they are still young, and they can keep doing this, even though they don't get let's say richer than our parents' generation, especially the millennials. The conference was talking a lot. They're looking for better ways of aligning work and quality of life. And I see that the remote workspace, the remote environment, is a way to go for the younger generation. So if the companies look for how they can incorporate people working this way, they will better attract those younger workers for their company. Let them travel and do the work.
Well, thank you very, very much, Felipe. It was wonderful to have you on the show. It was lovely to meet you online. And thank you because Felipe got in touch by filling in our podcast contributor form, which if you want to take part, you can do so as well. And the contact details for Felipe, well, the website of Mowe Studio is mowe.studio, studio. And also you can find him over on Instagram, again, Mowe Studio. And his name, if you want to check him out, is Felippe, Felippe, Silveira, Silveira. Now, as regular listeners know, in addition to being able to meet new people through the podcast, it's also a great way of getting back in touch with others. So, our next guest, I met Giovanni Batista Pozza at an online event a few years ago now, and I follow the stuff he posts on LinkedIn, even though it's in Italian. But that's okay, because you can translate. Wonderful. And Giovanni is the founder of Be Happy Remotely, where they help remote workers be happy through co-living and co-learning in the Costa Rica's Caribbean coast and Isola del Giglio in Italy, through workshops and training in person or online and retreats. So in talking to Giovanni, I got to find out not just what's going on in Italy, but also what's going on in Costa Rica, where he's been living for the past 2 years.
And I usually travel between Costa Rica and Italy, 9 months in Costa Rica and 3 months in Italy.
So it'll be very interesting to hear then what the comparison is between how remote work is seen and perceived in Costa Rica versus Italy, for example.
In the main city of Costa Rica, San Jose, there are many digital agencies and people that work in the digital environment. And remote work is normal here because it's very difficult to go around the country because of roads and a lot of rain. So it's very easy to work from home or to work from a co-working. So Costa Rica is good for remote working. For example, in the village where I live, there are many digital nomads that travel and work, and a lot of remote workers, people that usually stay here for 3 months or 6 months for a long period and work from here. It's a good country to remote work.
I had never thought of that. I think it's wonderful. Wow, I never thought of that. And of course, as you're saying, because the infrastructure might make it difficult to move around, so it makes sense.
Yeah, don't forget that infrastructure here is not always easy because, for example, in the main city, there are good internet connection. For example, here in Puerto Viejo, the Talamanca, the village in the south of Costa Rica, where there is the jungle and animals, internet connection is slower. Mm? For example, today I'm making this podcast from the co-working in the village because it's the only place where there is a fiber connection to internet. So infrastructure is a pain point here in Costa Rica because it's a rural country basically.
Even though the internet might not be as stable as we would like to, it still attracts quite a lot of people who can work on their computers, and I imagine they can work around, like you can work around your broadband availability.
Yeah, it is because there are many co-livings here, so it's very common for young people, for example, to travel and work in the meantime. They usually not say nothing about remote work because it's a lifestyle, travel and work remotely. So the concept of remote work is not unveiled here in Costa Rica. People work remotely and travel without think about it.
Ah, nice. You mentioned co-living. For some of our listeners who might not know what that means, can you just summarize very quickly? Just tell us what co-living is. We know what co-working spaces are. What is co-living?
Oh, co-living is an extension of co-working, living with other people, usually like-minded people that work remotely or has the same lifestyle or like travel. And usually, the power of co-living is to stay with like-minded people, so you can meet other entrepreneurs, other remote workers, and can grow opportunities about business, but also about friendship. It's about living together, and co-working is about working together.
It seems to me like co-living and co-working, they're the ultimate life-work integration.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great integration. People usually say that co-living is a form of co-learning because you learn with other people, and this is a very powerful form to learn in a group.
Okay, we could talk about that forever, but
Yeah.
I'll bring you back. But very interesting segue. Just wanted that to bring that in. Excellent. So, Giovanni, you are in Costa Rica, and you've given us a very quick overview of how remote work is, as you're saying, especially among the young people, the people who are traveling a lot around there. It's actually not an issue. And not even a thing. It's just how we live and work. How about in Italy? Who is working remotely in Italy? Let's start there.
In Italy, usually entrepreneurs, virtual entrepreneurs or location independent entrepreneurs, mainly freelancers, less employees work remotely because when you talk about remote working in Italy, you have to talk about smart working. There is a common practice, in Italy, surely, but also in other countries in Europe. Smart working is a term used to refer to the new ways of working made possible by technology and the opportunity to work in a flexible manner, respect to time schedule and the place you work. When you talk about remote work with people in Italy, usually they say, but are you talking about smart working? Okay, it's not a common term. It's more common the term smart working. There is a bigger term because inside the smart working there is the possibility to work remotely, but smart working is more than a remote working. It's about spaces, smart office, new layout, new level of collaboration between teams and individuals, a lot of things.
Is the term used in Italian also smarter working, or is there a different term?
The basic term smart working is very, very common in Italy. People talk about smart working as remote working. So it's very different from US.
There's not an Italian term for it.
There is a term, lavoro agile, that is agile working, a way to work in an agile manner, but this not mean agile like agile methodologies. Mm-hmm. Agile working is a new way of working, respect a flexible timetable and place, and also respect the objectives shared with other coworkers, and more engagement and more motivation for employers.
Fascinating. Again, that it is one more way in which we can have better work. And yes. Interesting because in the UK, the government introduced this whole thing around smarter working for the civil service, but it hasn't really spread out much. The focus has been on remote and flexible, but their use of smarter work, which is very much along the lines of what you're doing, the word hasn't stuck as much. So that's interesting that in Italy it has.
The Italian parliament has approved law aimed to improving work-life balance and working conditions for individuals who work from home. The law is number 81 of 2017, which regulates what has become known in Italy as smart working, and concern also the quality of workers performing the same duties respect to the place. It doesn't matter if a worker works in office or works out of office. So this law became very important for spreading the concept of smart working and so remote working through corporate, small and medium enterprises. It was very, very, very important to have this law in Italy.
Okay, so then it's starting to be widespread. It's part of something else. Do people like it, talk about it, seek it? Is it something that, as you say, people don't really think of, but sometimes they do it? How is it perceived amongst the population?
The population perceives smart working and remote working like something that can make the work happier and more balanced with life and work. So people know which are the opportunities of remote working, but there are some conditions to work remotely in Italy. There are few companies with 100% remote work style, for example. They usually are a network of professionals and freelancers without a classic employer. There are even less companies with a remote first approach. Is something almost completely unknown in Italy. Typically, an employer offers smart working as a flexible way of work with some days of work out of office, typically 1 or 2 days per week, And people usually work in these days at home or at a co-working, for example. Mm-hmm. That's the approach to remote work. People are used to work from home. Co-living is something unknown for a lot of people. Remote work is used in Italy like something you have to conquer from your boss or your employer. And also people prefer to meet physically and consider the virtualization of relations as a reduced form of communication. I know it's different, but it's perceived bad, not different. So we are, I'm Italian, but we are a Mediterranean people. So we prefer to communicate with co-worker in the office or with face-to-face discussion. So it's very difficult to introduce remote working in a company. Usually freelancers work remotely, but there are employers asked to be present sometimes in the office. So it's not a 100% remote work style. And also small and medium enterprises in Italy struggles with an old leadership style where managers know how to manage workforce in office, but they don't know how to do it virtually. This is a huge barrier to remote work. So I smile when I see on the internet or in an article how to convince your boss to work remotely, because it's very difficult to convince the boss in Italy.
And do you think this is something that might change? You were talking about Costa Rica, how the young people there, they don't even talk about remote work because this location independence is part of how they see life. Do you think that in Italy it might be a question of the younger generations bringing this in, or actually it's just embedded in the culture and there might not be such a big shift?
Oh, for sure. I guess it's an issue about a generational gap because from our research, Osservatorio Smart Working of the Politecnico of Milan School, that is an institution in Italy to observe and to have data about the diffusion of smart working. Mainly men between 38 and 58 years of age that usually living in the northwest part of the country work in a way of smart working or remote working, because younger generation, they ask to remote work. It is something that is a need for younger generation. So there is a generational gap between young people that usually want to work remotely and more, they want to work remotely 100% of the time. And an older generation where remote work is perceived something unknown, something that is very difficult to manage for managers. So there are a lot of barriers about remote work. And this is also an issue inside the organization, because there are a lot of people in the workforce that want to work remotely, and another part, usually the managers, that don't work remotely. It's like a battle, no? But I think it's a common issue in the world. Young generations want to work remotely very, very easily as well.
Wow, fascinating, because there's so much stuff coming into play.
Yeah, yeah. For me, remote work is a way to do something. No, not just work. Is to work and have the opportunity to live better, to stay with parents, to stay with family, and so on.
And you can follow Giovanni Batista Pozza on LinkedIn and Instagram, and Maya will stick the link in the show notes, and you can find out more about his company over at behappyremote.com. Right, let's now head over to Spain. To be honest, I'm not sure what's going on in Spain with anything, but mainly with the adoption of remote work. However, in the recent elections, because they happened in November, I did have a look at some of the parties' manifestos, and I found something that surprised me. So one of the parties was saying that we will give every worker with family responsibilities the right to working at a distance, as long as the job and of the work and the tasks allows for it. So I never thought I would see this in the manifesto of a political party, so I was pleasantly surprised, I have to say. But it also reminded me that still it's being seen mainly as a way of balancing life responsibilities with work, and also how we're still thinking about, well, if you have family responsibilities, if you have people who depend on you, if you're a carer, then how this can help to balance those responsibilities with work. So I can see that it's still being seen as something that is not normalized, but at least it's being talked about in that way. So anyway, we shall see. So I came across that. I thought I'd share it with you. And yes, something we're still at an early point in the conversation. So as you can see, I don't know much about what's going on, so I thought I'd get someone who really knows what's going on, and this was a great excuse to bring back on the show Eva Rimbau-Gilabert, because I've been dying to bring her back on, Eva, if only to catch up with her also. So Eva was last on the show 2 years ago, and she is the Associate Professor of Human Resource Management at the Open University of Catalonia, although she is actually based in Madrid, as she works remotely for the organization. And well, Eva kicked off our conversation with some general data. So let's let her tell us why.
Yes, I would start with some general data, I think, because that will give you a clear view of where is Spain regarding remote work. And the thing is that Spain is quite a laggard in the adoption of remote work, which I'm sad to say, but all the data is very, very clear. So I'm going to just give a few numbers. The most recent data, unfortunately, refer only to employees working from home and not other types of remote work. But I think they are useful anyway to understand what's the situation like. And the case is that in Spain, the number of remote workers that work from home is between 5 and 10%, is around 8%. And that's very, very different from other countries in Europe. For example, countries like the Netherlands or Sweden have around 30% of their employees working sometimes or usually from home. So you can see the difference. The main trait of our workers from home is that they are self-employed and not employees. The precise number is that it's 28% of self-employed in Spain work from home sometimes or most of the time. And in contrast, employees, only 3.5% of employees work from home. So that's quite a difference, and that says a lot about the managerial view of remote work in Spain.
And you shared very recently on Twitter these some of these numbers that you got from. Was it from the European Fund?
Yes, it was data from Eurofund.
Oh, yeah.
It's very clear there that there are stark differences between European countries. And digging a little bit more in data from our National Institute of Statistics is where I saw that most of our workers from home are self-employed. So I think that's sad because that means that companies are not really believing in the potential for remote work. And instead, when people can work for themselves, they can do their work from their home. So it's possible that companies don't trust maybe their employees will but there's clearly a long way to advance for Spain in this field.
What are the reasons, do you think, either hypothetically or from stuff you've read or heard, why is it that even though we know that people can work from home, as in if they're self-employed, they're deciding also to do that and they're still getting the work done, obviously. If the self-employed person doesn't work, their business collapses, they lose their job. So, well, what's going on?
One clear reason is economical structure, and that's difficult to change, okay? So not all fault goes to managers. So if a country has an economical structure with a higher number of businesses of the knowledge economy, then it's easier to offer or to have remote work because the knowledge economy is based in the creation and manipulation of ideas, of numbers, of notions, of concepts, and that can be with a computer from anywhere. So in a country where the knowledge economy is not so important as in other countries, we can expect lower numbers of teleworkers in general. So that's the case in Spain. So some causes may be structural and are difficult to change, and although there's progress, the change is very, very slow. It's difficult to change. For example, Spain is a country with a very important building sector and a very important tourism and hospitality sector, and those are not easy to adapt to remote work. So that's one cause. But there's also a problem of managerial quality in Spain. There are reports from OECD and surveys of managerial quality, and Spain, unfortunately, scores quite low. In Spain, high-performance work systems that include, for example, employment security, teamwork, goal setting, etc., is not often used in companies. So this translates also in modern human resources practices like remote work. So there's also a problem of managerial quality, managerial training, and it also reverts to the size of our companies, which is also a structural trait that is difficult to change. Spain has many micro businesses, and there the quality of managers tends to be lower. So that translates into lower trust in policies like remote work, for example. So it's quite complex. And all this managerial thing also translates into a culture of presentism, of wanting to have your employees present at the company, at the location of the company, instead of goal setting, which is, I don't mind where you are working from, I just want you to keep have you accountable for these goals, and I want you to give me the results we agreed upon. That's also missing in Spain. So all this together, I think, are the main causes for the lower numbers of remote work.
That's fascinating, and things I hadn't thought of. Like, of course, if we're looking at in the country what percentage of people are working from home, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That actually, it's not going to be the same as another country which relies on where there's a lot more knowledge work. And like you say, Spain also is so vast and so diverse that there's also diversity in the kind of work. So With the smaller businesses, because I always thought, and actually I have heard this coming from someone else also, that when you're a small business, it's usually knowledge work based. It's easier to do that remotely. But do you think that that is just that we haven't changed the way in which we view work also? So when we start our own business, we're still hanging on to presenteeism and stuff? Or why do you think there is smaller businesses are not able to?
Yes. Well, first of all, there are huge difference in the presence of remote work according to the sector, to the industry. So in ICT industries, remote work is widely present in all sizes of companies, but they are not so abundant in Spain, and that's the thing. Then if we go to the other sectors and for example to services in general, or manufacturing, I mind, small businesses have this problem of managerial quality. So the managers don't have the knowledge. Probably they have never been taught to agree about results with their employees. The small business manager owner in Spain is someone who knows about his or her industry and has been successful, so has decided to hire more people. But they don't know about management and they don't get the training. So they do what they can and what is easy for them. That is having people on site. If I see them, it's that they are working. And I can see they are working because I'm very close to them, unlike big companies. So I think that's the main reason. There's a lot of management training needed in Spain. We have to find a way of training and improving the view of small businesses managers about remote work. And that's in part the reason why I'm talking to you.
Yes.
and I talk to media sometimes in Spain, because I want this word to get to small business managers' ears.
So referring to your appearance in lots of articles and media, it's great. LinkedIn and Twitter, they're just so fantastic because I still find out everything you're doing. You had a point, one of the points you made in one of the Vanguardia articles, you mentioned that remote work was happening sporadically and not really becoming part of the system or becoming a system even in itself.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
What I'm seeing, and I don't have data, okay? That's my feeling from talking to HR managers and seeing what happens in a few companies I know about. What's going on is that the few remote work that we have is happening in a informal way sometimes. I mean, just the agreement between the worker and the manager, and there's no general policy, for example. Or when there's a general policy, it tends to accept that employees can work from wherever, maximum, let's say 1 day a week or 1.5 days a week. And when you do this, nothing really has to change. You don't have to manage differently if your employee is working from home, let's say, on Wednesdays, because you are seeing them from Monday to Thursday. So there's not really a reflection about what can be done in remote work. How should I manage remote workers? Because managers really are not having remote workers. They are just having a few hours when they don't see some employees, but nothing else is changing. And if we don't think about what has to change in management in order to get the most from remote workers, you really don't have a remote work policy. Everything changes when people work from home more than half of the time. You cannot manage the same because really then you can lose track of what's going on with these people. What are their results? How are they doing in general? If they have any problem, etc. But that's not happening in Spain widely. Of course, there are cases. But even in these cases, in the cases I know, there's not a real reflection of what has to change in managerial practices. How am I going to touch base with these employees? They just trust that the employees will perform what they are expected to do, whatever it is. But there's not an open reflection about what has to change. And that's what I mean by when I say that there's not a real system change in how, let's say, the managerial tasks perform when you have teleworkers or remote workers. But because in general, remote work is so anecdotal that nothing has to change.
That's another interesting reflection. The fact that, because I do hear this sometimes, is yes, I work from home on like one day a week, and that's the day when I get all my work done. But it's almost like a bubble. It could almost be done. You could just go into a room in the office and shut yourself out. There's no, like you say, there's no communication practices that have been adopted to allow for that flexibility. And also maybe one week I want to work the whole week from home, but then we're not set up for that.
Exactly.
Okay, I get you. That's really interesting. So do you think also there's something around, and again, this might be just your feeling, but you've been working, let me ask you, because you've been, we're going off script here, but you've been working remotely for a while. Can you tell us about your specific situation?
Okay. Yes, I must confess, I researched myself. And yes, my personal experience goes into my research ideas, and yes, that's very useful. Well, you know, my university is based in Barcelona, but I live in Madrid since 7 years ago, I think. So we have an office of the university in Madrid too, but it's not a place where I get relation with other professors. It's more a student-oriented office. But I go there and I talk with people there, and I like that. But really, my academic work is done on my computer at home. So in my case, for example, we have a policy that allows us to do remote work up to 80% of the time. But there is no real training for managers of hard remote workers as I am. I should say I've managed upwards. I have always had excellent relation with my managers, my deans, and that always helps because, as you know, trust is paramount for the success of remote work. So, but I've made it always a point to remain highly visible for my managers, my partners, and my colleagues in Barcelona by sending emails, by answering to anything that's asked, etc. And so the point is, I always suggest to people who are working remotely the most of the time in a company, of course, not for themselves, to make the effort to be visible and to talk with everybody when they go in person to their site. And that's exactly what I do. When I go to Barcelona, I'm all the time talking to people in offices, in hallways, and getting to know how things are going there. And that's always useful.
That's very interesting that because you mentioned that culture of presenteeism, which can get in the way of adoption, and you've gone, okay, well, that is something that I need to look at, and this is how I'm going to deal with that.
Exactly.
And listeners, Eva just mentioned about managing up. So if you want to know more about that, you can listen to episode 115 from the 30th of March 2017, where I spoke to Eva about some research she came across and some of the stuff that she had found out. That is very interesting to hear from that experience, how you've done it, how you work within a culture where it's still not normal at all to have someone in that degree of remoteness. Let's say that. Do you think culturally, as a society, I'm also so there's the managerial aspect in organizations, which of course is part of culture. But do you think that there's something in the society? Is there an appetite for this, or actually is this something that we want to keep work at work and home as home? What's the feeling?
I think that there's an increasing sensitivity about or interest about, let's say, not remote work specifically, but flexible work in general, and then improving work-life balance. And of course, remote work has a place there. The importance of that is increasing in Spain. And recently we had a new law that talks about digital disconnect, the right to digitally disconnect. So that means that digital connection is increasing and increasing. And that's a form of remote work that is not being assessed. We don't have good numbers about how many hours are employees, for example, devoting to the WhatsApp group of their work. And that's remote work too. And you don't have to have an agreement for that. The company just expects you to be in that group and to answer what's said there. And that's going on in Spain a lot. I mean, I think that Spaniards, we don't mind mixing our work relations with our personal life. And that translates into our participation in many work WhatsApp groups and similar. But WhatsApp is a widely used tool in Spain also for work. And that's remote work. And there's a sensitivity that it's going too far. And that's why I think this right to digitally disconnect has appeared recently in Spain. Now it's becoming more and more the moment for that. But I'm afraid that if the evolution of the economy is not good, this won't progress, because when the economy is weak and people fear for their employment, for their jobs, all these flexible work arrangements lose ground. So I'm expectant of what will happen in the next 1 or 2 years with the economic situation in Spain, because the last data are not too good. So we'll see. I think there's a social interest, but maybe the economy won't help.
I just want to hear a bit more about how the economy and people fearing jobs and how that affects remote work. But before that, you mentioned something, and I've just remembered that you shared an article once that, and I will put the link in the show notes, although it's in Spanish, but it can be translated, about there was an appetite for either remote or more flexible work, but people weren't getting it. Do you remember that article?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly that. Mm-hmm. People want more flexible work, more work-life balance in precisely. Mm-hmm. And everybody thinks of the means that would be or best serve them. That includes remote work, but that includes flexible schedules or etc., whatever. And they are just not getting that. And I think that in part that's because of a mistrust, a problem of trust between managers and workers. That's also a problem of managerial capability. If you fix goals, or I prefer to talk about results, if you agree about the results an employee has to offer in the next period of time, you don't need trust. You just need accountability. Even though in Spain we have a problem of trust between managers or companies and workers, as we do, we could overcome that through good managerial quality, but we are just not doing that. That's why people would like to have some more flexible workplaces or better work-life policies, and they are not getting them.
Yes. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on is you mentioned the law to disconnect, which is really interesting, as you're saying, this double-edged sword of so people who are not labeled as remote, we're still using a lot of digital communication, and that's filtering into non-work hours or whatever. And so there's a sense that needs to be cut down. But at the same time, if we want to adopt remote work, we have to rely on that. So there's something interesting I hadn't thought about. Is there anything else happening around remote law-wise or in Spain? Are there any other, for example, I'll tell you an example I heard a couple of years ago now about companies in the north of Madrid around San Chinarro and Las Tablas. There's 4 big organizations there, and they were saying, well, we're going to start to recommend or allow people to work from home because the traffic at peak hour in that area is so bad. Is there any other ways in which either at a government level or at a wider level that remote work is being seen as some kind of solution?
I'm not thinking about anything else lately. This the right to digitally disconnect is the most recent, maybe. In general, there were prior to that some legal developments or law developments regarding work-life balance, but it mostly affected public workers. So maybe it was expected that other private sectors would follow. It's being reflected in some collective agreements, and some collective agreements now have some lines about remote work, which is good, very, very good, but they are still very, very minoritary.
But you did mention those working for the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the law with that, or what's that?
It's more about flexible scheduling and things like that. Mm-hmm. Not so much regarding remote work.
Okay, good. Interesting. I haven't got a clue so what's going on. Okay, so let's go then to how the economy can have an effect on whether remote work is more widely adopted. Well, one, you talked about presenteeism, how important it is to be seen to be there. How else can a downward economy affect us?
Yes, when I was commenting the general data, I forgot about one very marked characteristic of, the Spanish labor market. Spain has one of the highest rates of temporary employment in Europe. And by temporary, I mean really short contracts. They can be from a few days to a few months. And they can even be connected in sequence. So the same person works for the company for 3 years, let's say, but always with a temporary contract. And that is another aspect that doesn't help remote work. In general, all this type of policies that can be considered a benefit for employees, flexible schedules, remote work, etc., if there's a policy about that, it is very, very usual to offer them only to permanent employees, not to temporary employees. Therefore, we have another cause of our low numbers of remote work. What's more, these temporary employees, which are over 20% and close to 30% in some periods, they want to become permanent employees. So what do they do to give their best image to their managers? Just be there. They are present in person as much as they can, because that's what managers value. If you are there all the time and you are a hard worker. So when people are afraid of losing their contract, even if it's temporary, or if they are afraid of not becoming permanent, they tend to be present in person more hours, because as I was telling you, in Spain we have a problem of presentism, of managers valuing the presence, the number of hours that employees are present in the company facilities. And that has a lot to do with the kind of contracts we have, and also with the economic phase we are. Of course, in a phase of crisis or low economic growth, people are more insecure in their jobs, even if they have a permanent contract. So they tend to be there to be seen by their managers.
And it's really sad when you think about the fact that if there is if the economy is not growing or it's not or is not in a good state, remote work could help to cut down on costs, to all this stuff. But this is what we associate with. We associate being there with being committed.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting too that just drawing a parallel with the UK. So Mandy Garner from Working Moms was in episode 212 talking about, which was about remote work for social change. And she also mentioned that they've been advocated for more flexibility, etc. But this working away from the main office and from most colleagues is affecting people's career progression in organizations. So I think this is something that we're seeing where it's been adopted. And of course, it's a real fear, obviously, in people who haven't adopted it and in these situations. So what do you think could happen? What do you think will be the drivers behind this adoption, if it is adopted? And I'm actually looking over on the next 5 or 10 years, because, as you say, I think the next few years are going to be quite complicated. But what do you think will be the drivers when we actually see, we're not asking everyone to go remote, obviously, but those people who can benefit from it, and where will we see the option, this office optional approach that we love? What do you think the drivers will be?
Well, I'm not very optimistic. I think, as I mentioned, that the social need is there, but I don't think the economy is going to help. I don't think we are going to have a clear improvement in our managerial quality. And I'm not sure there's going to be anything done from the legal side that can really impact about this topic in particular. So maybe what we could do is get people to talk about that more. And for example, there has been recently an experiment done in Microsoft Japan. Did you hear about that?
Yes, I did. But
well, that's we can discuss the quality of that experiment. Okay,
it was only 4 weeks, wasn't it?
Okay, so the quality of the experiment is arguable.
Yes,
but it has gotten the attention of the media, and people are talking about that, and that's what I'd like to happen. We need to have people talking about that, about remote work, about how it works, how it has worked for some companies, and we need to have examples beyond Google or Microsoft. Or smaller companies. And for example, for me, it's very interesting the case of the born virtual companies, but companies that from their origin, they were 100% remote. And I'd like them to have more presence in the media so that people get used to the idea that this exists and this works. I also think that there will be a natural improvement, as has been going on in the last decade. Although Spanish numbers are low, they are slowly increasing. So I think they will keep increasing and improving in the next 5 or 10 years, simply because we trust technology more. And not seeing people nowadays doesn't feel as remote as it tended to feel. Now we feel people in WhatsApp as close to us or in other social networks. So as people get used to the idea that that others, employees in this case, who are remote and who connect with you through digital media are real and are there, as we get used to that, remote work will be increasingly accepted. But the main drivers of remote work, which I mentioned before, I don't really think they are going to improve. So I'm sorry to say I'm not very optimistic about it.
It's okay. It can be slow, and we can help drive that conversation.
Yes.
So if listeners want to get in touch with you or connect with you, and you're very active on social media, what are the best places for them to go to?
I'm really easy to find. And I love to hear from people who are interested in the same topics I'm working on. So just please get in touch.
And you can follow Eva Rimbau-Gilabert over at LinkedIn. And on Twitter, she's at Rimbau. That's Erimbau. And she tweets quite a bit in English on both platforms. So do check it out. So lots of parallels between Spain and the world that I am in touch with. Not the contributors to the podcast mainly, but to the people around me, the companies I hear about who are struggling to change their way of working, and sometimes parallels with people in the UK who've come to some open workshops that I run for Hub events. So, for example, I recently listened to an episode from All Hands on Tech, which is the new podcast by HR Zone. And Carrie Cooper was talking there about well-being. And he also mentioned how smaller businesses, because they have less resources, less HR resources, tend to have more problems with well-being, as well as sometimes they absorb the very hardworking entrepreneurial spirit of the founder, and that seeps into the rest of the company. So again, there's that small businesses struggling because of size, and also because, as Eva said, because we don't always, when we set up a business, know how to manage people. It's very different. So there's that parallel, and also the fact that many people associate remote work still with working 1 or 2 days from home, which, as Eva says, can be done without changing much in the way of not just management practices but teamwork practices as well. So it's really, I think that's why really good, effective online collaboration has proved that it's proven to be difficult to implement. And also I'm finding companies who they don't need to even look at that, because they've been doing the 1 day from home every now and then and 2 days from home. But as Eva says, we're still relying on a lot of face-to-face interaction, even in those setups. So lots of parallels there. So thank you very, very much to our 3 guests, Felippe, Giovanni, and Eva. It was fascinating for me. And listeners, I would love to hear what you thought about this episode if you want, but also how you are experience location-independent work or any other kind of change in the way that we've traditionally been working. It's not only about remote work. There's other ways in which we're changing our working practices too. I would love to hear about any of that, and also specifically how the place where you're located and the kind of interactions you have with local people, how that affects how you view your work and how they view the work. Tell us. So virtualnotdistant.com for your long form comments, at Pilar Orti for your short ones. And now I will leave you with the stock outro. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.